Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by Ndis Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello, everybody. My name is Debbie from Ndis Property Australia, and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that explains, guides, highlights, and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. And today we have a special guest speaker, Kate Daniels from Lavan Lawyers in Western Australia. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, Debbie. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, lovely to have you on. We've been planning to get you onto an episode, and I think we've both been so busy the last couple of months. Being the fact that the NDIS review has recently come out, it seemed like a really good time to maybe just talk about, what it all kind of means and maybe some of the implications, complications that maybe you're seeing come out of this. So just as a bit of background, could you introduce yourself and what you guys do over at Lavan?
Of course. So as you said, my name's Kate. I'm a lawyer working in Lavan's aged care, seniors living and disability team. So we work primarily with providers on whatever issues come up, really. We do everything from large corporate transactions right down to small pieces of bespoke advice about privacy issues, SDA corporate structures, building requirements, really whatever our clients need, we're there to help out. So I do definitely think it's a great time to be having this conversation because the NDIS review, as you said, came out on the 7th of December, and it certainly has a few things to say about inclusive housing and living supports, and particularly SDA.
Yes, it does indeed. We've had a couple of episodes we've recorded regarding the review, our thoughts of it, our initial reactions. So maybe could I ask you what your initial thoughts are on the recommendations in the review?
There was nothing in there to me that I found hugely surprising. I think a lot of it echoes what came out of the Royal Commission and then goes perhaps a step further. So I think it will be interesting to see what legislative changes come out of the review. There are a lot of recommendations that I think will require legislative change, and whether or not those changes are acted on and then when they're acted on will be very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the one thing I've been really wondering about is how those legislative changes are going to take place, how long it's going to be. And I guess the big question is that, obviously they've said this is going to be a 5-year process, but the NDIA does need to actually respond to the review. And all they're saying at the moment is it's going to be in 2024. Given the fact that it's the end of 2023, that's pretty broad. It'd be really nice to...
I think we can all relate to that feeling.
Yeah. Is it going to be next month? Is it going to be in 11 months? Yeah, especially, obviously there's a lot of providers out there who've got stakes in things like support coordination, plan management. That was other parts of the review that look like they're going to have some significant changes being brought in. But certainly from our perspective, when we're looking at the home and living and specifically the SDA side of things, it does kind of leave us in a bit of limbo with regards to what's going to happen with that improved livability funding.
Yeah.
So as you know, the recommendation 9.4, action point 9.4 was that the IL category be replaced by an alternate SDA design category to meet the assessed needs of participants. So what do you make of that?
So looking at the recommendations and looking at the way that SDA is being used and looking at the data, I can see where the recommendation has come from. The improved livability category is by far and away, my understanding, the most commonly funded category, but it's not the most commonly constructed category. In my experience, that's not really, particularly, I suppose, the Commonwealth government, it's not really in line with their view of what SDA should be for. It's not for, SDA is not there to simply replace a home in which people with disabilities are living and receiving supports. It's there for people who cannot live in mainstream housing. So I think looking at, if you look at it in the context of wanting to find those budget savings, I think changing that category and introducing that new low-cost category that they mentioned for participants who are sharing their 24/7 SIL supports and don't require those specialist design features, it could be something that makes SDA more accessible. I'd be interested to see how that actually comes across in the legislation and what that category looks like. But I do think there's the potential there for it to open up access to SDA.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, the way we see this is at present, 44% of all SDA funded participants have IL. And as you said, it's the least constructed housing. But I think the main reason for that is that prior to June, when the new price review came out, the funding for IL was so low that it just wasn't financially feasible for people to develop IL because they weren't going to get the returns. So, and we saw that being addressed in the price review that came out at the end of June. That seemed to address that very issue, that there were majority of participants having IL funding, not having anywhere to move into because nobody, they can live in an FA or a HPS home, but nobody was accepting them because the funding they had was too low. So we saw that as being the price review committee saw a way to fix that, and we thought that was a fantastic thing to do. This seems to be a complete turnaround, obviously totally different review panel. And it's like they're saying, well, no, the price review people got it wrong. This is not how it should be. And I guess they're looking at it from a different perspective that, as you said, some of these people may not necessarily need to live in a special designed dwelling.
Yeah, when we're looking at SDA, I think one of the things that really hits home for me as a regulatory lawyer is when we are talking about client capture and we're talking about the separation of SIL providers and SDA providers, recommendation 9.7 makes a very explicit recommendation to mandate legal and practical separation of accommodation and supports.
Absolutely, yeah.
So when we're looking at that, I think it sort of fits into this in that if we can talk about pricing, we can talk about legislation, we can talk about, different corporate structures that come out of that, but it's not, that's sort of the legal aspect. So there's a legal separation of accommodation and support providers, which a lot of providers are on top of. We're increasingly seeing the sort of the SDA division being spun out into its own corporate entity. But it's that practical separation. So the best way to think of it is if we're thinking about the regulatory perspective, it's not a top-down perspective looking at, okay, well, what's the pricing? Where are we going to get the best return? That's the provider perspective or the builder's perspective. All of these recommendations are being made from the participant's perspective.
Sure.
So when we're thinking about a practical separation, what does that look like to a tenant going into an SDA house? And what Action 9.4 is saying to me is this improved livability category from the participant's perspective? Is this doing what SDA is meant to do? Is this driving the market where we need it to go? And I'm not sure that it is. Because as you said, there are SDA providers who are coming into this from a for-profit perspective. And if IL is not attractive to those developers and it's not being built when it's the type of SDA that is most in demand, then it's not meeting those needs, and it needs to be looked at.
Yeah, look, it's one's perspective, and I know it very much is tied up with the care requirements, and that does bring in that whole separation of supports. I guess just to round off the way we're kind of coming at it from is that we know there's a lot of the participants that have got funding for improved livability, they're currently living in maybe legacy homes, group homes, old, not fit for purpose, basic dwellings. If a lot of those properties are going to be defunded, and we know from providers telling us that some of these properties really just are so old, they have to be replaced. And that brings in a whole nother part of the recommendations that the government has said that they will look at refurbishing some of these properties. But at the same time, where are these participants going to move to? If where they're living is going to be refurbished, where do they go in the meantime? That's sort of where we're seeing it. Obviously, there's a lot of different perspectives to look at this from.
No, well, I would actually, I think we're on the same page there. Definitely the current group home model, which is still really prevalent for those participants who need that shared 24/7 SIL supports and 24/7 supervision, it is a problem because what we are seeing is that a lot of those participants are not meeting the SDA criteria. They're not being considered to even be funded for IL, but they're currently in these group homes that you're completely right, are being rightfully decommissioned. They're not safe. They're not fit for purpose. They don't do what they should be doing, but there's no alternative for them to go into. And certainly I know from doing some plan reviews with participants that they are getting feedback that, well, that's something for the state government to fund. That comes back to community housing. So I think really what these recommendations are looking at to me is saying, okay, well, improved livability is SDA. Is that what it's meant to be doing? And if it is meant to be doing, if we want SDA, which will facilitate choice and control for participants and give them more choices in where they live and how they live and who they live with and how they receive those supports in their home, then how can we make SDA work better for those goals? And that's what I think we have the recommendations for a new low-cost category of SDA for those participants currently living in group homes. And then how do we make sure that we don't get SDA just doesn't become the new group home? So then you've got the recommendations for restrictions of SDA dwellings of 4 bedrooms or above, unless it is the choice of participants. And really working towards, I think, I forget exactly when they said, but over the next 5 years or however long, really phasing out that model of having group homes which are run by a support provider and they are also providing the accommodation. And then you've got, that's how you get those client capture and those closed loops, which we all know.
Yeah, totally. And that does lead back to that whole separation of supports that we have been talking about for a very long time, that we see that needs to happen. So let's talk a little bit more about that from as they say, it's got to be a legal and practical separation.
Yes.
From the legal perspective, so we do know of a number of, larger organisations that have done both, are doing both. Mm-hmm. They have now formed 2 different entities, but it's still owned and operated by the same owners, the same company. How is that going to be separation enough?
That is a very good question. It will be very interesting to see when the legislation comes through. What I would say is that a legal separation, so for instance, say you have a large SIL provider and they spin out a company which is essentially just a shell, which is leasing the dwelling back from the SIL provider, and there is no real separation. In my view, that's not going to be enough. That's a legal separation if you're looking at it from the top. Yes, if you look at the corporate structure, there's a separate corporate structure. But what is that actually doing? When we talk about practical separation, if a participant is coming into that house, do they know that their SDA landlord and their SIL provider are two separate entities. Can they identify that? And if they can identify that, can they have faith in that? So there's a whole host of considerations that would go into that about what is a real practical separation of accommodation supports and your support provider.
Yeah, yep, totally agree. It'd be really interesting to see where that does go.
Yeah, definitely. I think we will see in 2024, we are going to see a mandated, legislated formal separation between SDA and SIL providers. I think there will be some limited exceptions to that. One that I know has already been flagged is regional and remote areas.
Yeah, of course.
It will be very difficult to get separate SDA and SIL providers. Well, I would hope to see that there could be an exception for providers of niche services. So there are some areas in which I can see that a very specialist provider might also be the best accommodation provider, and it would be in the best interest of the participant to have one provider providing a very specialised and niche service that only they can provide. So that's another exception that I would hope to see in the legislation.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think particularly in areas like robust category, I do know of some SIL organisations that's all they do is they look after very specialised, robust needs clients.
Yeah, and they're very unique needs.
They need accommodation built for these clients that they look after, and they are prepared to fund it and build it. So, I totally agree. I hope that is going to be another exception because I think that does work.
Definitely. I think probably we'll also see legislation brought in for additional monitoring and enforcement of compliance in SDA, potentially whether that is by way of new practice standards or however it's brought in. I do think that SDA providers will be under more scrutiny, which I think is going to be very interesting in the SDA investment space, because I know there are a lot of SDA providers who have enrolled a dwelling but perhaps don't fully appreciate the regulatory compliance that is required to be an SDA provider. It's more than just being a landlord. You do have obligations to your tenants. And I think we will see definitely more monitoring of those obligations coming in.
Yeah, definitely. And look, we are aware that, basically being an SDA provider is being a property manager. Now, any other property manager in Australia has a real estate license, and that's obviously covered by a whole lot of regulations, and yet SDA providers don't need to do that. And so, I think there is a lot of room for more control and compliance for sure.
Yeah.
Let's talk more about now the upgrading and repurposing aging SDA stock owned by states and territories. This sort of touches back on what we were just speaking about before of participants living in these older properties and where they're going to go and how is that going to happen, and the fact that they're basically calling out the states to step up and take a bit more control back. Yeah,
so state housing, traditionally that would be an area for state housing. We all know that, state housing wait lists are incredibly long. Those mainstream services currently, I don't see would be able to accommodate the number of people that would be coming out of group homes. So I think there is a question there, if it's going to be handed over to the states, how do they ramp up the capacity to deal with that and to provide enough accommodation, and in a way that doesn't just create a new wave essentially of group homes. There needs to be a balance there between ensuring that the NDIS is sustainable into the future. It needs to be financially sustainable, and state housing is a responsibility of the state governments. But how do we hand that over and make sure that it happens in a way which is empowering and does deliver that choice and control to people with disability?
Sure, yeah. And I guess that also might come back partly to the new SDA category, low-cost SDA category that they are talking about. and which we see as being kind of more of just a SIL home, basically. But again, it's, you know, the SDA and the disability accommodation as a whole across Australia is facing the same issues that the regular housing market is in Australia. There's just not enough housing.
Yeah, and I think definitely there's the recommendation in there that particularly in regional and remote areas that the state governments do step in and actually build SDA housing and be the SDA provider. So then that comes back to, again, and I'm sorry to harp on about this, but it comes back to the separation between accommodation and support providers. So would have state-owned SDA, but it is different to the current SIL group homes in that your provider is not the government.
Yeah.
You can have a separate provider of your supports. If you unhappy with your provider, you can choose someone else and you're not going to need to move out of your home. And that's really what separation is all about. So I think they need to be looked at together. The two recommendations.
Yeah. Look, it's just totally, it's certainly a lot, I think, that the NDIA have to review and work out how to make it workable. I don't know how they're going to do that. So very interesting to see what's going to come out of this. Was there anything else that came out of the review just in general that you wanted to sort of talk about that we haven't already covered?
We could talk about the requirements for like SIL providers and SDA providers to collaborate, like a little bit about what that might look like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. So, yeah, definitely. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So if we go back to what we were talking about previously with that regulatory perspective, I think, and bringing in the new regulations potentially for greater oversight of SDA providers and that relationship between the SIL provider and the SDA provider. And really, I think what that comes down to is we know that a key principle of the NDIS Act and the NDIS in general is that people with disability have the right to exercise choice and control over their supports and services. And so how do a SIL provider and an SDA provider work together to make sure that that right is being upheld? So what does that involve in terms of providing the choice, making sure the participant has the control over what is happening with their life, where they live, who provides their supports, and then how do the SDA provider and the SIL provider collaborate to make that happen? So there are a number of there are practice standards which apply that both the SIL provider and the SDA provider need to comply with. What the key areas I think to think about when you're thinking of that collaboration are: how do you manage participant privacy when you're doing that? How do you clearly define the roles of each provider? So what is the SIL provider doing? What is the SDA provider doing? How do you make sure that the choices are being communicated and then actioned by the right provider? How can the SIL provider and SDA provider actively work together to manage and reduce not only any actual conflict of interest between the two of them, but the perception of a conflict of interest? So how can you reassure participants that you are dealing with it? And then what arrangements do you have in place to make sure that those supports are being provided in the best way? So that's where we come back to that corporate structure of having the SDA provider that really is either a shell or it's a very closely related entity to your SIL provider. Maybe there's common directors, the properties are all, there's no proper agreements between the providers. How do you really separate that out but still have a relationship where you can work together? So one of the things that I would say, to put yourself in that mindset of the participant, thinking from that regulatory perspective of bottom up or from looking at it from the participant's point of view. So do your residents in SDA have enough information and understand that information, that they can make decisions about the way in which they're provided with SIL supports and SDA supports. And do they feel safe and secure and confident to, for instance, provide feedback or make complaints or make decisions about their SDA supports, knowing that it's not going to affect their SIL supports, or their SIL supports knowing it won't impact their SDA supports. So even if an organisation has a policy that our SDA residents, they don't need to use us for SIL. If they want to engage another SIL provider, they're welcome to. How is that communicated? Is it because if a participant can't even identify that their SDA provider is not the same entity as their SIL provider, how on earth are they supposed to know that the two don't come as a package deal?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right from looking at marketing, advertising, looking at the tenancy agreements, looking at the service agreements with the SIL provider, the whole way through, you need to think, how are we making this clear that they are very separate? You can choose another SIL provider and you can stay here. Your accommodation is not tied to how you're receiving your supports. If you have a problem with your SIL provider, yes, we collaborate with them to get the best care. But if you have a problem with them, that's not a problem with us, and you can stay here. So it really is coming right back to that relationship with the participant and thinking about how to present that information in a way that not only reduces actual conflicts of interest, but reduces the perception of conflict of interest.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, I'm so glad that we've got that in those recommendations. Not a surprise at all, because we have known it's coming, and it'll be really good to see what that ends up looking like.
Yeah.
On to another area. I don't know if you have any thoughts about the sort of the legal perspective on the removal of support coordination and local area coordinators, replacing them with navigators, a new role that they're bringing in, or they're talking about, they've recommended to create. So yeah, moving away obviously from the whole home and living area. But this is just another area I found really interesting in the recommendations.
I haven't looked at that one too much, actually.
Yeah, because when we looked at it, we sort of thought, well, hang on, aren't they just renaming it? Aren't they going to be doing the same thing really as what a support coordinator does, with maybe just a bit more kind of control there? So that's, look, it's something else and I'm sure there'll be a lot more conversations come out of this as time goes on. But I thought that was an interesting...
Yeah, one of the other recommendations I just have to find it now, the document, for SDA providers is recommendation. So the recommendations for increasing tenancy and occupancy protections.
Right, okay. Yeah, I think the other area that was of interest too out of this whole review, again, away from home and living, was and this is something that came out even before the report was released, was the agreement that they're going to implement foundational supports as being a part of the NDIS, but also separate from it. So in that it can be either inside or outside of. And I thought that was probably a really good way of, just putting in, especially for so many children have been joining the NDIS that may not necessarily really get the best benefit out of that. And this is obviously a way of addressing that and helping to ensure the longevity of the NDIS.
Yeah, definitely. I think looking at anything which looks at ways of how to better deliver that early intervention support, I think is just going to be for the benefit of these kids as they come up through. And yeah, the NDIS originally was designed for, people with the highest levels of disability. And I am 100% for early intervention, but with a view, I suppose, to ultimately what you would hope, and I think what all of us would hope for our children, is that, you can have those early interventions, and if you can provide that support when they're younger, then they can live the most independent and enjoyable life that they possibly can as an adult. So on one hand, there is I do believe sometimes that people look at the early intervention program and all they see is cost, where really we all know the benefit to society is much greater than the cost when you look at it. But also being someone who has had to get early intervention supports organised for my children, anything that makes it easy and anything that makes it more accessible, I think will be a fantastic change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly where that's going, and I'm glad. So, I think that ultimately, the review was really welcome. There was a lot of great stuff in it. Yeah, some questions around some of the home and living, how they're going to actually make that work and what it really means. But I guess just to round this whole conversation up, what are your thoughts as a whole of the review and the legalities and the implementation legally of the recommendations?
Well, I think the thing to note about the implementation is that not every recommendation is going to be implemented in legislation, and certainly it's not going to be implemented necessarily next year. But yeah, it'll be interesting to review the legislation when it does come out and see how it is going to be implemented and what transitional provisions will be put in place to manage that transition away from group homes and, in the words of the NDIS review, those closed circuit SIL homes, and how we move away from that into potentially more SDA, state government provided SDA, the new low-cost category of SDA. It will be very interesting to see not only what the legislation looks like, but also what the plan for transition looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are waiting with bated breath for more information to come out of this. And I think we shouldn't hold our breath on that, because it will be, I'm sure, sometime for them to really go through all of this and let us know what their plans are with it. But Kate, thank you so much for your time today, just to give us a little bit of a legal perspective on what's come out of this review that we're all still sort of digesting and grappling with. It's really interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm also, still digesting it. Still, every time I read something new, I get something else out of it. So I'm sure that, for a long time to come, we'll be kind of having light bulb moments of, that's what they were getting at.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. Yeah, no, it's really good to hear your take on it. So thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Debbie.
And we'll hopefully chat to you again at a later date.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.